Purim Sameach! Happy Purim! Today I'm going to be talking to you about a very special Jewish holiday called Purim or Purim. Now you're not going to find this holiday in Deuteronomy or Exodus because it's not one of God's appointed feasts. However, it's considered a minor festival and it's still just as important and just as fun. Where do you find the information about Purim? You will find it in the book of Esther. And if you're curious about the story behind the holiday, all you have to do is find a Bible, open it up to the book of Esther, and all the events are laid out for you. Today I'm going to be talking to you about why this holiday is important to us believers, and also share a little bit about what makes this holiday so much fun and a wonderful opportunity to celebrate God's goodness, His grace, and His salvation. Are you ready? I'm ready! So where do we get the name Purim? The origin of the name Purim is the word pur. Pur means lots. This is referencing how in the story of Esther, Haman casts lots in order to decide when would be the best day to exterminate all the Jews in Persia. So some of you might be wondering why I'm wearing a costume. This is clearly not normal everyday fashion. And I don't celebrate Halloween, so it's not for Halloween. The reason I'm wearing a costume is because this is what Jewish people do on Purim. I've been to Israel during the holiday of Purim and it is so much fun. Everyone is dressed up. You can find all kinds of costumes. Butterflies, you might see a few superheroes, you might see a few ninjas, you might see some dinosaurs, you might see some fairy princesses. But traditionally, they try to dress up as good characters from the Bible. Even better if you dress up as a good character from the story of Esther, like Queen Esther or Mordecai. But why do they wear costumes at all? Well, the story of Esther is a very unique story. For one thing, God is not mentioned at all in the book. If you don't believe me, go read it yourself. But God is not mentioned at all in the book, but every event that happens in the book of Esther, we see God's invisible hand. It's almost like God is in disguise. You can't see him, but he's definitely there. So that's why they wear costumes. Speaking of costumes, I think it's time to switch up my look for something a little bit more traditional. I'll be right back. How about this? So before we go any further, we gotta go back to the Bible. I need to give us some historical context because I love history. I don't know about you, but it's always good to know what's going on and how did we get to this point. Now, if you're familiar with your Bible, you should know that God had a chosen people. His chosen people were called the Israelites. Long story short, they had a covenant with God, but over the years, something terrible happened. Both the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, because Israel split into two, began following other gods. They began following the culture and patterns of the people around them. They had some terrible kings. And the next thing you know, they've broken that covenant that they made with the God who loved them, with the God who saved them. And so God uses the Assyrians and the Babylonians to bring judgment on his people. A lot of them are killed, a lot of them are exiled, and Israel, it seems, is no more. But as we know, looking back through history, that is never the last word. Now the Jews are scattered all over, and it seems hopeless. But something miraculous happens. A new king in Persia rises up. His name is Cyrus the Great, and he amazingly allows the Jews to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple. Under Cyrus the Great and Darius the Great, his successor, a lot of amazing things happen for the Jews. They're allowed to go home. They're allowed to rebuild the temple. It's not easy. They still have to deal with all the enemies around them. But there is hope for the first time in a long time, and there is a renewal of that covenant. Now it's important to know that when Cyrus lets the Jews return to their homeland, then not everyone does so. And perhaps we can understand why. For a lot of them, this is the only life they've ever known. they're comfortable, maybe they have a good house, maybe they have some wealth, maybe they don't really like the idea of uprooting their whole entire family and going to a land where they're definitely going to have to suffer in order to rebuild their home. Now, the story of Esther takes place in Persia, in the capital. Xerxes the Great is the king in the story of Esther, and the Jews that are mentioned in the book are primarily the ones who live in Persia. So clearly, these are the ones that did not go back to their homeland. When we think about these people, perhaps, and of course it doesn't say so in the text, but perhaps we can imagine that because they chose to stay, because they chose to keep to their lives in Persia, maybe they had varying levels of faith. Maybe even some of them were worshiping Persian gods. Maybe some of them had completely forgotten about God and were content as they were. Maybe some of them had a sort of spiritual indifference where they don't really think that it matters too much. And we know, because we know there are characters like Mordecai and Esther, that there were Jews who maybe they didn't go back to their homeland, but they still had a heart for God and they still had a heart for following God. We see this group of people and perhaps we understand where they come from. Perhaps you're in a situation where you feel comfortable. Perhaps you're in a situation where if God told you to move, you'd be a little hesitant. So maybe we feel that there's a little bit of a distance between the people who stayed in Persia and the people who went back home to the homeland. Maybe they felt that distance too. Perhaps some of them felt like, you know what? We're not in the Holy Land. There's no temple. Maybe it feels like God has forgotten us. Maybe it feels like God has rejected us. Maybe we've rejected God. In any case, they spent a long time in captivity, and for some reason, they chose to remain in captivity. And that brings us to the events of the book of Esther. That comfortable, quiet, peaceful life is over. There's a new man. His name is Haman, and Haman hates the Jews. And we know this because Haman, the Bible says, was an Agagite. So that means he's a descendant of King Agag. Now, King Agag was the king of the Amalekites. You should remember him from 1 Samuel 15. The Israelites were supposed to destroy the Amalekites, but they didn't. And Haman's very existence is proof of that. Now, Haman is determined to kill all the Jews. And it doesn't help that he really hates Mordecai. He sends out, with the king's permission, a decree of extermination. This decree goes out on the 13th day of the first month. This should be kind of interesting to us because that is actually the day before Passover begins. According to Numbers 28:16, Passover is supposed to begin on the 14th day of the first month. Passover remembers when God delivered the Jews out of slavery in Egypt. So it's kind of interesting that this decree goes out right before the festival of Passover. In any case, the Bible says the people were bewildered. Perhaps they lived such a comfortable existence that this had not even crossed their minds as a possibility. According to Esther 3:15, they were confused. This came out of nowhere. And in Esther 4:3, it says, there was great mourning among the Jews with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So this, for them, is a dark moment. It is perhaps, for a lot of them, the darkest moment in their life. Yes, they've been exiled, but in exile, they've had a fairly okay life, most of them. And then this happens. This death sentence comes down upon them. And it seemingly comes out of nowhere. And they don't know how to respond. So how do they respond? They weep, they mourn, they cry out. And we know, because God is so good, that when his people cry out, he hears them. So even though God is not mentioned anywhere by name in the book of Esther, we know from how he acts and who he is that he heard his people's cry. We know he remembers them. And not only does he remember them, this is an opportunity for God to remind them who they are. Perhaps it was easy for them to think, I'm in Persia, I'm not in the Holy Land, I didn't go back. God's probably forgotten me. God probably is focused over there. He's not thinking about me. I'm suffering, but what does he see? I'm suffering, but what does he care? But the truth is, God cares. We may lose things. Humans are very good at losing things. But God doesn't lose things. And God especially doesn't lose his beloved people. Definitely, this is a terrible situation. But in this terrible situation, we see God partnering with his people. The ones who haven't bowed down to idols, the ones who are seeking him, the ones who are crying out to him, he partners with them. We see a character like Mordecai. Mordecai, who does so much by faith, who stands up to a man like Haman, who has so much power, who is willing to speak out and encourage others to do the right thing. And we see people like Esther. She's in a difficult situation too. She's in the palace. She's very close to the king. She's living her life in secret. He doesn't know that she's one of the Jews. And it's Mordecai who says that very famous verse to her that spurs her into action. He says, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will rise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish, and who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. That's Esther 4:14. And Esther, who could very understandably just pretend that nothing is happening and it's all okay, rises up as well. So we see people rising up because God has reminded them who they are. They are his people. He is their God. Then comes a miraculous time of spiritual revival. Esther tells Mordecai, go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. This is Esther 4:16. Esther calls for a mass fasting before God. And it's not just her, and it's not just her and Mordecai, it's all the Jews that are there as a nation together before God. The purpose of fasting is repentance and reflection. It's remembering that God is the provider of all our needs and the source of our life. And it's a serious moment where it's just you and God, and you going, I have nowhere else to go, and there's nowhere else I would rather go. But I am calling out to you, I am crying out to you. So even today, as Christians, fasting is very important as well. But here in the story of Esther, it's an important moment where as a nation, the Jews come together and they turn back to God, regardless of what came before, regardless of their motives for not going back to their homeland. They go back to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And their repentance and their seeking sets off a chain of events in the book of Esther. A chain of events that leads to their ultimate deliverance. And this is beautiful because it's a reminder that even in a foreign land, God is still with them. God has not forgotten them. That he is there and he has heard them and he is fighting their battles for them. If you remember, God made a covenant with this people. He said to Abraham, their forefather, I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you, in Genesis 12:3. And here in the book of Esther, we see him, centuries later, still keeping that promise. What's unique about the book of Esther is you have a bunch of miracles, but they're disguised. Just like God is hidden because his name isn't spoken out or written down, we have a bunch of miracles that are disguised as very normal events or natural occurrences. Only by looking at the whole picture, reading that whole book of Esther from the first word to the last word, can you see God's miraculous hand doing some amazing things. So why does Purim matter to Christians? I mean, it's a fun holiday, and who doesn't love a good fun holiday? But why is it important? Well, first off, I would say there's a theme of deliverance. It's a beautiful reminder that our God is the God who saves. Our God has delivered us from sin. Our God has always been faithful to his people. He keeps his covenant. He has saved them over and over again. and that is a good testimony for us, that when we are suffering, when we are lost, He will find us and He will be there with us. It also reminds us to remember who we are, even in a dark world. And this world is very broken. So it's easy for us, as we live in a broken world, to get dragged down and to forget who we are. Maybe like the Jews who decided to stay back in Persia. And just like them, we a lot of times need those reminders of who we are. Also, this holiday is a reminder that even though we don't see God working, or we think He's not working, or we think He's forgotten us because we're in a time of darkness and suffering, that He is definitely there. This story should be a comfort and an encouragement for us, because it's a reminder that even though we can't see Him, even though it doesn't seem like He's doing anything, God is most definitely working. And He's working maybe behind the scenes, but He is moving. And He is doing so to work all things for our good and His glory. And that is why Purim is such an important holiday. Even though it's not one of the major festivals of the Lord, there's still so much that we can get from this story. Now, when it comes to celebrating Purim, it is important to remember that this is a festival of joy. It is a festival about rejoicing that you are alive. And not just like physically alive, but if you believe in Jesus or Yeshua, you are spiritually alive as well. So it's a time of rejoicing in life and in salvation. And that means this holiday is a whole lot of fun. One way Jewish people celebrate Purim is with food. And perhaps that's something that every people group on earth shares in common. We all enjoy celebrating with food. So today I'm going to make some Purim cookies with you, but first I think it's time for a costume change. Now I'm ready. I'm a ladybug baker. Okay, so the first thing that you're gonna need to do before we gather all our ingredients is we need to preheat that oven. So preheat the oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 170 degrees Celsius. So I'm gonna go do that. You're also going to want to prepare a few baking trays for our cookies. I've prepared 2 here. You're going to want to line them with parchment paper and set them aside. These are the things that you're going to need. 2 large eggs, 2 1/4 cups of all-purpose flour, 2/3 cup of sugar, 1 teaspoon of baking powder, 1/4 teaspoon of kosher salt, 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract, 1/4 cup canola oil, 1 teaspoon of orange zest, and your chosen filling. In this particular recipe, I'm going to be using Nutella or chocolate hazelnut spread. You should also have 1 to 5 teaspoons of water on the side just in case you need it. Before we begin, I'm going to tell you a little bit about this cookie. It's typically a triangular shaped cookie, so it has 3 corners, and there's a sweet filling inside. The dough itself can be a butter dough or an oil-based dough. Today I'm going to be doing an oil-based dough because it's easier to work with, but the butter dough cookies are definitely delicious as well. Most traditionally, these cookies are filled with a sweet poppy seed mixture, and this is to pay homage to Esther's supposed diet in the palace. Nobody knew that she was Jewish, so the story goes, in order to keep kosher, she kept to a vegetarian diet. And some stories even go the extra extreme and say she only ate seeds and nuts. Other fillings include apricot, chocolate spread is a favorite of children for obvious reasons. I've seen people get very creative with it. We're gonna get a little creative with it too. But in any case, you want something that's sweet in the middle and you want it to be rather on the thick side so that it doesn't bubble over or run over. I tried to use jam once, it did not go well, let me tell you. So what's the name of the cookie? It has a couple of names. In Israel, it's usually called Oznei Haman. In America, it is usually called Hamantashen. The origin of the name is pretty fun, so I'm going to share that with you. Some say that the reason the cookie is this unique triangular shape is because it's supposed to represent Haman's hat, because we're eating his hat, I guess. Another explanation is Hamantashen is Yiddish for Haman's pockets. According to one tradition, he had triangular pockets. Oznei Haman, which is what they call it in Israel, literally means Haman's ears. because another traditional story goes that Haman had triangular ears. I don't know if I believe that, and I don't know why anyone would want to eat someone's ears. Another interpretation, there are many as you can tell, is that the three corners are supposed to represent Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Some even say because the filling is going to be hidden by the dough, that it represents God's presence in the story of Esther. Regardless of why this cookie is called what it is delicious, and I hope you enjoy making this recipe with me. So let's get going, because I'm ready and my oven beeped, so it's ready too. And we're back. The first thing that you need is a bowl. This is going to be your main bowl, so you want it like a good medium size. And you're going to need a whisk to help mix everything up. And you're also going to need a zester or a microplane. First thing we're going to do is crack our eggs into our bowl. In they go. I broke one, but that's okay. Next thing you're going to do, you're going to add your sugar. This is about 2/3 cup of sugar. I know it looks like a lot, but we're going to make a lot of cookies, so in it goes. As you add the oil, you're going to whisk it so that everything gets nice and mixed up. We need about a teaspoon of zest. If you don't know what zest is, it's basically the outside colored part of the orange. You only want the colored bits. You don't want the white part underneath the colored bit because that can be a bit bitter. You can kind of see me taking away the orange part. I'm being very careful not to get the white bit. I was right, it's about half the orange, and now you have an orange you can snack on, you know, to balance out all the cookies you're gonna be eating. Healthy. And give it another little whisk so that everyone can get to know each other. Now you're gonna add 1 teaspoon of vanilla. Give it another whisk. It smells really good. Now you're gonna put this aside and grab another bowl. I have a slightly smaller bowl here. I'd actually recommend probably getting a bigger bowl, but I like to live on the edge and be a little risky. So we're gonna use this bowl and maybe make a bit of a mess. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my flour, which I've already measured out here, and I'm going to sift it into this bowl. The reason we sift flour is to make sure that there are no lumps and clumps in case some moisture got into it, and also just to make sure everything's light and airy. Now your sifter may look a little different than mine. That's okay, as long as it gets the job done, we're good. Now most of my flour is in here. A little bit ended up on the cutting board, but you know, that's what happens when you take a risk. Now I'm gonna add my salt and my baking powder. Technically, you could have sifted them all together, but I don't really like washing salt bits out of my sifter. So, okay, now I have my wet ingredients back and I have my dry ingredients. Using a wooden spoon or spatula, if you have it, you're going to mix the dry ingredients into the wet in 3 installments. So don't dump it all at once because we actually have more dry than wet, so it's going to look almost like it's not enough wet for a little bit, but if you persevere and keep going, you'll be fine. So 1/3 in, give it a mix. When it's about half mixed together, you're gonna add another 1/3. So I'm about ready, so here we go. And you guessed it, when it's about halfway mixed together again, you're going to put the remaining bit of flour all into the bowl. This last mixing is going to look like you have too much flour for your wet ingredients, but that's okay, don't worry. It will work out in the end. You're gonna keep mixing until it comes together into a dough. My mixture is looking crumbly, which means it's about ready for me to get my hands involved. I've rolled up my sleeves and I put on 1 glove to help me so that I can mix it with my hands. If you don't mind touching your food that much, you don't have to wear a glove. This is personal preference. So I'm just using this and squishing them together until they form a dough that I can roll out and cut circles out of. And there you go. I have cookie dough. Yay! I should probably not do that. Okay, the moment has come and we're gonna make these cookies. Make sure you have your sheet tray on the side ready to go. You're gonna need some flour to dust your cutting board or your countertop, whatever you're using. I have my cookie dough right here. See? Also, you're going to want a rolling pin to roll it out. You also want something that cuts circles. So I have a biscuit cutter. It cuts a 3-inch diameter biscuit. So I'm going to be using this. 3 inches is about 7 centimeters, I think. I don't know, I live in America. If you don't have a round cookie cutter, you can also use a cup. Just make sure you dip the cup in some flour before you press it down so that the dough doesn't stick to it. You should also make sure you have whatever filling you're planning on using ready. I'm going to be using some chocolate hazelnut spread because everybody loves chocolate. You're going to need about 1 teaspoon of filling per cookie. First things first, dust your board. Also roll up your sleeves. I'm going to take about half the cookie dough first because I don't have a large workspace. You can do it all at once if you have a large workspace. You're gonna wanna roll your cookie dough out to about 1/4 of an inch thick. In centimeters, that's about 3/4 of a centimeter, I think. You'll see. So put it down on your floured surface, put a little bit of flour on top, flour that rolling pin a little, and get to rolling. When it's all rolled out, you're gonna cut out your circles. If there's any extra dough left, you can lump it all together, roll it out again, and keep going until you can't get any more circles. The easiest way is when you press down with the cookie cutter, give it a little twist, and if you did it right, it should pop right out. Before I work on the rest of the dough, I'm going to show you how to fill these. Make sure you have your filling ready. I'm going to use an actual teaspoon to make sure that all the filling is the same amount. Now comes the part where you fold them. There's a couple of different ways to do this. The most traditional way is to just fold up 3 sides and pinch them together shut until you get a little triangle. There's our first cookie. I went to a Purim party in Israel with a bunch of children, and let me tell you, everyone's cookie looked very, very different. Some of them were arguably not triangles, but at the end of the day, it tasted good and everyone had fun, and isn't that what matters? Don't worry about putting the cookies too close together. This particular recipe doesn't spread very much or expand, so I can usually fit quite a bit on one sheet tray. All right, now I'm gonna get ready and roll out the rest of my dough. And just repeat as before. So fold up one side, fold up the other, pinch them together, turn and fold up the third side, forming our triangle, and pinch the edges together. Make sure it's nice and tight and flattened, because otherwise it will open up and you'll have a chocolate in the middle of a circle cookie, which is still good, but not quite what we're going for. And then put it on the sheet pan. Our first sheet tray is ready for the oven. You're going to bake them for 20 to 25 minutes, and you'll know they're ready when the edges of each cookie are lightly golden brown. All right, to the oven. While we wait for that to bake, I have a little surprise. So just like most cookies, you can adapt this recipe to whatever flavor you like. I've seen people do a chocolate cookie base. If you want to do a chocolate cookie dough, all you need to do is replace equal amount of flour with equal amount of cocoa powder, and then they put peanut butter in the middle, so you have chocolate peanut butter cookies. I've added sprinkles into my cookies to make like a funfetti cookie. I've put fruit in the middle. So I was wondering how I could adapt this recipe to be a little bit more Asian inspired to reflect my background. So last year I made green tea hamantaschen with red bean filling, and it was delicious. So I'm going to show you how to do that today as well. So I've already prepared my green tea cookie dough. I believe in Chinese it's mocha. because it's matcha green tea. You want to make sure that you have the food grade powder that you can eat. It gives everything a nice green color. The recipe is exactly the same. The only difference is you're going to add 2 tablespoons of matcha powder into your dry ingredients before you combine them. Also, instead of vanilla extract, I used almond extract to give it a slightly different flavor. So let's roll it out and make some cookies. I've also prepared some red bean paste. I don't know how to make red bean paste, so I bought this at the store, but it's delicious and it will work perfectly for a filling because it's thick and sweet and it's not going to run when it's baked. Then you're going to fold them exactly the same way you folded the other ones. So you can do the pinching method where you just fold up the triangle sides and pinch them up and flatten them a little to make sure they don't open up. So now you have a nice green tea triangle cookie. Our pan of green tea hamantaschen with red beans is ready for the oven. You're gonna bake them for about the same amount of time. And we're back. And our cookies are done. They look delicious and I can't wait to eat them. But before we do, I wanted to wrap up a couple things and just send you off with some reminders. Purim itself is a day of joy and celebration. It's a celebration of life. Just like in the story of Esther, the Jewish people are saved and they get to live. It's all about an unrestrained joy in God's deliverance. That God has saved us and He has given us life. So we're going to live life abundantly, just like it says in the Bible. Traditionally, most Jewish people will go to their local synagogue or congregate and they will read the entire book of Esther out loud. It's very fun. They call it the Megillah, which means scroll. They will read it out loud and you are supposed to make noise. If it's Mordecai's name or Esther's name, you're supposed to cheer and clap because they are an example of what we should do. Yay! If you hear Haman's name, however, you're supposed to boo and make a whole lot of angry noise to cover up his name because we don't want to remember his name. It's also traditional to give money to the poor during Purim. It is also very common for people to give gifts of food to neighbors, to people in need. And the thought behind this is that we lived together, we survived this time of suffering and danger together, so we're going to celebrate life together. So it's a time period where you don't want anyone to go without. What's especially fun is that children are encouraged to participate in this. Not just the eating, because children will do a great job at that. And not just the dressing up, because the children will also enjoy doing that. The children are also encouraged to give to the needy, to deliver these gifts of food to neighbors. It's even better when you don't deliver it yourself, you have a third person do it so they don't know who it's from, because it's the whole idea that we are showing love and celebrating together as a group. And we want our children to learn that as well. And like most Jewish holidays, it is very traditional to have a big feast with lots of food, hopefully lots of cookies. And at the end of the day, don't forget to celebrate life. You've been given new life. When you walk with Yeshua, the old has gone and the new has come. And you are to walk with that kind of life and joy every day, not just on Purim. And don't forget to partner with God. Just like Esther and Mordecai and all the Jews partnered with God during this time where it felt like there was no hope, God gives you and me the same opportunity to partner with Him, to do good, to show love, and to speak life wherever we are. The world is a pretty dark place. In this moment, I want you to remember that you have not been placed where you are by accident. You have been placed where you are with a purpose by a God who loves you for such a time as this. Shalom and Hag Purim Sameach.